the red diamonds. The latest available reading is in blue. It's come down, but not yet by enough to ensure that inflation returns durably to target. In large part, this is because labour markets remain tight, putting pressure on nominal wages. As pressure in labour markets ease and monetary policy continues to work its way through economies, services inflation should continue to decline. However, the full impact of past monetary policy tightening remain uncertain, and there is a risk that service price inflation proves more sticky than expected. Getting monetary policy right is a challenging task. Monetary policy will need to err on the side of caution and maintain a restrictive stance to ensure inflation will durably return to central bank targets. Declining inflation will create room for lower policy rates, and this room will need to be used to avoid stifling economic growth. But central banks will need to strike the right balance in setting policy in uncertain circumstances. We expect most major advanced economy central banks to start reducing rates throughout 2024 if disinflation continues. And emerging markets may act sooner as inflation has been falling for longer. Such near-term challenges are important, but we must not lose sight of what matters in the longer term, the need to strengthen the foundations for growth. Trade drives growth and increases productivity, but after 20 years of increasing global trade, particularly in services, over the last 5 years, trade growth has stalled. This poor performance is due to both cyclical and structural factors. The current environment of modest economic growth dampens trade, but we're also seeing longer-term change in the appetite for global value chain integration and a steady increase in trade-restrictive policies. Moving on to public finances, too many countries have fiscal plans which don't address the scale of the spending pressures they will face in the medium term. Across the OECD, public debt is now over 40 percentage points of GDP higher than it was 20 years ago. Looking ahead, governments face large fiscal pressures. A significant part of debt will be rolled over within the next 3 years, at higher rates, implying an increase in interest rate payments for years to come. To add to this, significant spending pressures will come from changing demographics, increased health costs, the climate transition, and needed investments in skills and education. Governments will need to ensure their fiscal plans reflect the fiscal reality, recognising and addressing the future costs and confronting the trade-offs and policy choices. One of these future pressures is linked to the climate transition. As you can see on the left-hand side, 2023 has been the warmest year on record, but despite the mounting climate crisis, policy actions lag behind the pledges to reduce emissions. The right-hand side shows how far off the desired trajectory we still are. Policymakers need to get their act together and cooperate to introduce policies that effectively and efficiently curb emissions around the world, including through harnessing private investment at much greater scale than has been achieved to date. I want to end by talking about perhaps the most important economic issue in the long term. That is equipping future generations with the knowledge and the skills that they will need. On this, the latest OECD data should be a wake-up call. The OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, provides the most comprehensive data on comparative educational performance across the world. In 2022, PISA tested the educational outcomes of almost 700,000 15-year-old students from schools in 81 participating countries and economies. And the results, published in December, are deeply troubling. As you can see on the left-hand side, student performance has been declining in advanced economies over the last 10 years. And for reading and maths, there's been an unprecedented decline in the last 3 years. Emerging markets have also seen a fall in the most recent performance, but by less. This is extremely worrying. Human capital is the foundation of knowledge-based economies, and ever-increasing technological change will increase the returns to education. So lower educational outcomes will have increasing costs over time. And of course, education doesn't just benefit economic growth, but also the well-being, health, and inclusion of people and of societies overall in the long run. The reasons for these troubling findings are complex, and we are looking further into the details. The 2022 data will have been affected by the pandemic, and we know huge costs were paid by those in education. This chart is a stark reminder of the disruptions to schooling that COVID brought in our countries. There is a generation of students who've paid a price for these school closures, and we know that the impacts hit disadvantaged students the hardest. Urgent action is needed to make up for learning losses throughout this period so that the students affected do not suffer worse outcomes across their entire working lives. Governments have a choice about how much they focus on education. And I want to be clear that good outcomes are not only about resources, but also are about ensuring practice keeps up with the best evidence on what works in delivering high-quality education. We can see here how education competes with other pressures and represents a relatively small part of total government spending. And with demographic change, those other pressures on health and pensions will only increase. Governments need to think hard about their priorities and their approach to spending and policy reform across generations if they want to equip their economies for the future. So let me summarise our main messages today. The good news is that inflation has been coming down, but it is still too high. GDP growth has held up relatively well in 2023, but we expect uneven and more modest growth across countries this year and next. As inflation declines, interest rates can and should eventually be lowered, but monetary policy should remain prudent. At the same time, fiscal policy needs to focus on ensuring sustainability, including through reforms to reduce current and future spending pressures. Governments need to act to improve educational outcomes, including for the most disadvantaged students. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, Secretary General. We'll move to the questions now. For those watching on the Zoom, participating via Zoom, please go ahead and continue putting your questions through. We'll go to the first question from Masaru Senu of GG Press, Japanese press agency, who asks if you could give a little bit of the major reasons behind the revisions from last November, particularly for the Euro area, which you've revised down a bit, the US, which you've revised up. Sure.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, the revisions that we've got in the forecasts that we are publishing this morning mainly reflect the data outturns that we saw in the 2 months since our last update. So in particular, we've seen slightly weaker data in the euro area on both growth, and for the US, we've seen stronger data on growth as well.
And there was also a question about Japan, which you've revised downward for 2025.
Again, that reflects the recent data that we've seen emerging from the Japanese economy.
Moving to a question from Matteo Allievi with Reuters, a question about Spain. Can you provide some more details on why Spain will be the most resilient economy among the 4 large Eurozone economies?
Sure. I mean, the Spanish economy suffered less than the other European economies from the inflation crisis. It saw a smaller rise in inflation, and so real incomes were less affected than in other European economies. Of course, going forward, Spain faces quite similar challenges to other European economies, both through changing demographics, the risks that the economy faces in terms of as monetary policy increases, as monetary policy is tightened, and so the impact on demand. And of course, Spain also faces challenges around the inclusiveness of its labour market, in particular with respect to young people.
Okay. A question from Peter Ryan with ABC in Australia. He asks for our view on the Australian economy. Also notes that the Reserve Bank of Australia is currently meeting. Should they be considering interest rate cuts given evidence of slowing inflation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, the position for Australia is similar to other countries. It's difficult to navigate the way through the path on balancing the strength, on balancing the impact of monetary policy on growth and on inflation. And so, as other advanced economies, we would advise the Australian economy to look at the data as it's emerging before taking judgments about when to start easing monetary policy.
Before carrying on with the Zoom, just checking if there's any the journalists here in the room who may have question that they'd like to put forward? Does not appear so. Moving on, Paolo Levi from the Italian press agency ANSA. What is your main message to Italy today?
So our main message to Italy is actually to think about medium and long-term economic growth, like all advanced economies, but particularly in Italy, the need to get growth up in the medium and long term is critical, not least because of the large debt, public debt that the Italian economy faces. So we would encourage focusing on the long term and, of course, the steady pace of fiscal consolidation and implementing the National Resilience and Recovery Programme.
Checking one more time here in the room if there are any further questions. Do not see any further questions from the Zoom either. That being the case, thank you very much. We'll call the press conference now. All the information, obviously, on site at oecd.org. Thank you.
Thank you.